Hey, let's start off with a quiz. So in order to get from position A to position B, what is the easiest way to get there? We're going to be talking about the path of motion in this video and how it affects shoulder impingement and your ability to reach overhead. So stay tuned and we'll get to that. Hey, real quick, make sure you like the video, subscribe to my channel, share this with your friends if they love anatomy too, and go back and watch the first 3 videos of this series because we talked a lot about compression and tension, and I'm going to just gloss over that stuff in today's videos. If you want a refresher on those topics, go back and watch those and then come back to this video. All right, let's get to it. So to get from position A to position B, we've got 3 basic options. So we can flex the arm, that would be to reach forward and up. I'm going to skip letter B, I'm going to go to abduction. Abduction would be reaching out to your sides and then up. And then there's scaption, and scaption would be reaching sort of in between those options. Some people think that they're all the same, but that is just not true. There are good reasons why one would be different than the other for certain people. So the correct answer is scaption. Okay, scaption is the correct answer. Let's get into it. So first we got to define these. I already gave you a general definition, but scaption is a term that many people are not probably familiar with, so I'll just define it. It's scapular plane elevation. If flexion is reaching forward and up, and abduction is reaching out and up, then scaption is just in between those. However, there's a more specific definition of scaption, and this is the reason why it's the easiest. Before I get to that, we need to understand tension and compression. Again, I had 2 videos that talked a lot about tension and compression. So if you really want to understand these, go back, watch the first 2 videos of the series. Basically, tension is a pulling or a stretching force, and compression is a squeezing force. Okay, so you're either stretching things or you're squishing things. That's it. Now, if we look at this a skeleton from overhead, there we go, then basically if we've got this plane here, which is just straight side to side, and then we've got the scapular plane, and the scapular plane is the direction basically that the glenoid fossa, the actual joint surface of your scapula, your shoulder blade, is facing. And it's facing exactly this way. Okay, so let's take a closer look at that. So here I've got the plane of the glenoid fossa, which is exactly this direction, and then the scapular plane, which is just perpendicular to it. Okay, so it's just the direction that the glenoid is facing. Okay, so it's not facing straight out to the side, it's not facing straight forward. Okay, it's facing at a diagonal. Let's take a closer look at that. Now we're just adding layers. I'm trying to add complexity here. So if you reached straight out to the side, then you would be performing abduction. If you reached forward and up, you would be performing flexion. Okay. And if you reach in between those, then it is scaption. Now this is important because what happens is that in the ball and socket, there's a center point, and then if you rotate a lot, you've got less contact of the joint surface. Now I'm being a little bit inaccurate here because really the joint will slide back into place. But I'm trying to give you the idea that you've got maximal joint surface. The joint surfaces are touching maximally in the center. Okay, when you move to one side of the spectrum or the other side of the spectrum, you have less joint surface contact, which means you have just a little bit less stability and strength. And it also means that you have additional tension and compression on opposite sides of the joint, which is going to limit your range of motion. Okay, not that any of that is good or bad always. It's just that we want to take those into consideration if somebody is having trouble with a motion. Okay. Adding complexity. This is a spectrum. Okay, so in the center is the easiest motion. In the center is the scaption. Okay, it's a scaption again is scapular plane elevation. And then if we go off into one direction or off into the other direction of the spectrum of motion, then we're going to have unique and added challenges to our motion. If, for example, we choose to take the path of flexion, then what's going to happen is that the muscles on the posterior, that's the back side of your shoulder, they're getting stretched out. So the muscles in the back get stretched. That means they're under tension. That's okay. It's not a bad thing or a good thing. It's just that they're under tension. And if your muscles are not used to moving like that and getting stretched out, then you're going to have trouble reaching overhead because your muscles haven't gotten used to that yet. Then on the opposite side of the spectrum here is that stuff is going to get kind of squished over on the front side of the shoulder. And that means it's being compressed. Again, not necessarily good or bad. Maybe for some people with certain shoulder conditions, yeah, it might be a little irritable if you try that. The point is just that now on the front side of the shoulder, you're going to have compression. So just to reiterate that, if you take the path of flexion, then the back side of your shoulder will be under tension or a stretch, and the front side of your shoulder will be under a compressive load or getting kind of squished. Okay. If, however, we choose to take the path of abduction, then it just flips. All the same stuff is true, but you just flip it. Okay. So now the back side of the shoulder gets squished and compressed, and the front side of the shoulder is getting stretched out. It's under tension. And if the muscles on the front side of your shoulder aren't used to getting stretched, then it's going to be harder for you. Plain and simple. Quick note about abduction is that in addition to this tension compression stuff, abduction has a unique difficulty that flexion does not have, which is that you have more likely, you're going to have compression of the subacromial space. We reviewed that in the first video of this series. So if you want a really in-depth explanation of that, you'll have it. But let's move on here. So scaption would be in between these two. So scaption would be that you have basically the maximal surface of the joints in contact with each other. So you've got tons of stability. And then the musculature on the front and the back side of the shoulder. And by the way, I said muscles are getting stretched, and that's true, but I forgot to mention that also the joint capsule itself, the ligaments themselves on the back side, in what, like if here, let me just go back. If you were in flexion, the backside muscles and the backside ligaments are getting stretched. Okay. And the front side labrum would be getting compressed. In abduction, the front side ligaments, muscles would be on a stretch, and the backside would be compressed, including the labrum. Okay. Now in scaption, everything's more balanced. You've got sort of equal amounts of compression and tension on all sides of the joint, backside, front side, and that includes the muscles, ligaments, etc. Okay, so you've got maximal freedom of motion. So it's just easier for most people. If they're having trouble with one or the other, try to have them do this, and it's probably easier. So what? Well, so what? We just progress and regress. It's not that abduction's bad, right? Or flexion's better, or scaption is better. They're all different motions, and you should be able to try all of them. You should be able to move in any direction you like to. But if you're having trouble, then this teaches you, well, what might be getting in the way. Maybe it's some muscles that don't like to get stretched out. Maybe it's a strength issue. And by the way, there are other things that I haven't even talked about in any of the videos of this series, like neuromuscular control, inhibition by muscle spindles, fear and avoidance, and things like that. That's a whole nother subject. But the simple version is that scaption is going to be the easiest option for most people. Abduction would be the hardest. Flexion is kind of a middle ground. It's easier than abduction because it kind of rolls the stuff in the subacromial space backwards and out of the way. Again, see the first video of this series to understand that concept. And here's just a little picture. I made this one a while ago. I don't like the X's anymore because it sends the message that you should never abduct. But what I noticed, the reason I made this drawing in the first place was because I noticed people were here in our yoga pose, and they're trying to reach their arm over their head this way, and they kind of get stuck. And this is pretty common. I've seen this a lot as a yoga teacher. And again, you don't have to go to people and say like, oh, you should never reach your arm over your head like that. Don't ever reach to the side. Don't tell people that. But if you notice somebody's having trouble with it, then just try to guide them instead in this forward and up position, or maybe in between, because they might have an easier time with that motion. Again, don't scare them, but just realize that because of the tension and compression elements, they might have an easier time with a certain path of motion. So today's video, we talked about the path of motion, flexion versus abduction versus scaption when you're trying to reach over your head, and how that plays in potentially to impingement and your freedom of motion when you're overhead. In previous videos, we talked about compression, we talked about tension, we talked about the scapula itself. And in our final video, which is our next video, we're going to talk about putting it all together. How do we make sense of all this information without being dogmatic? Please like this video, subscribe to my channel, because then you'll get a notification when I release the next video of this series, and you definitely want to see that. If you've watched this whole thing, then clearly you're into this kind of information. Share this video with your friends. Tell them to watch it because, there's a lot of misinformation out there in the yoga communities and movement communities. And I'm trying to set some of that straight and trying to explain it in a simple way that makes sense and that you can take home with you and apply immediately. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.